If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What's your favorite creepy campfire story? I remember one that one of my Cub Scout leaders told us on a campout when I was Prob 7. It took place during pioneer times. A man and his wife traveled west in hopes of either striking it rich with gold, or at worst, finding a nice plot of land to settle down on and farm. Manifest destiny and whatnot. A few months into their journey they come across just the spot. A beautiful plot of land to make their new home. Winter would be coming in a couple months, so they build a hasty shack and figure they'll hunker down there for the winter, and build a more established house in a few months when the weather is more permitting. They don't worry, as the area is teeming with wildlife for hunting and trapping, so they figure they'll be set for food. A couple of months go by and the winter is bitter cold and unrelenting. They've finished off the last of their food stash, and they haven't seen so much as a squirrel in weeks. They're both slowly starving and freezing to death as they huddle in their shack, day after day with no end in sight. The man's wife is delirious with hunger. Fearing that they will soon be dead, he decides to go for a hunt. He musters the energy to bundle up and heads out, determined to stay out as long as it takes to find them both some food. A couple of days pass as the man takes shelter under impromptu stick shelters, keeping warm with a campfire in the night time and hunting in the daytime. Nearly frozen to death, mercifully the man spots a beautifully plump rabbit several yards away. He takes aim with his musket and bang. It's a perfect shot. With the newfound energy the man runs home, giddy to finally feast with his wife. What he doesn't know is that while he was gone, his wife had discovered some tasty flesh of her own. Literally. The hunger had driven her insane, causing her to believe that her now frostbitten fingertips were ladyfinger cookies. She started off with a few nibbles here and there, slowly pulling the flesh away from her bones. After just a couple of hours both hands were nothing but bone. So she worked her way up her arms to the elbow. The feeling of something in her stomach just continued to drive her further, until she had chewed away at every last bit of skin she could reach, culminating in her chewing off her own lips. The husband approached the shack with his, now frozen, kill when he got an uneasy feeling. Fearing the worst, he steps up to the door and slowly opens it, expecting to see his wife's corpse shriveled on the floor. But instead what he finds is even worse. This zombie-like creature with exposed teeth and bones writhing on the floor at the sight of him, chomping its jaws with an insatiable hunger. At that point, one of the scouts screeched for the leader to stop, which I was extremely thankful for, as it was easily the most terrifying thing I had ever heard at the age of 7. The scout leader told it with real conviction too. Honestly still gives me the creeps if I go camping and happen to think about it sitting around a fire. The golden arm, or at least the version my mom tells. A fellow is looking to be married to one of the rich merchant's daughters to gain the fortune that would come with her. Fortunately the merchant had an unmarried daughter still, so the fellow begins to court her. The first thing he noticed is that she had a solid gold right arm. She apparently lost it in a childhood accident and her father had a golden arm forged for her. Seeing this as a sign of extreme wealth, he continued with courting her, making her believe he truly loved her and not for her father's money. In turn she fell deeply in love with him. They get married and the fellow is given his riches along with part of the merchant business is now father-in-law owned, thus giving him more money. However, he soon realized his wife was now of no real use, so he ignored her, gave her gifts and had dinner with her, but the love he said he felt had disappeared. Angry and heartbroken, the daughter accused him of marrying her for her money, in which he boldly states of course. She was furious, screaming about going to tell her father what a scoundrel he truly was and their riches would be stripped away along with his job. This angered the fellow. After all he worked so hard to get to here, he wasn't going to let her take it away. So he pushed her down the cellar stairs and let her snap her neck on the stone. He plead heartbroken to the grief-stricken father, losing his most favorite daughter, the fellow's riches intact. The fellow and family hold a funeral for the daughter and weep and cry. When it was but him and his dead wife, he opened the casket and pulled out a saw, for she did not need her golden arm in the grave. That night he slept with the arm under his pillow, not wanting even the servants to see it before he melts it down into bars. He slept soundly until a voice like the wind asks, "Where's my golden arm?" Slow and far away the voice echoed through the sleeping house, so quiet he thought it was just a draft. Until the voice came again, closer and louder this time, as it down the hall. "Where's my golden arm?" Sitting up the fellow looked around fearfully, too scared to do anything as he hears again much closer, "Where's my golden arm?" He felt a heat on his back and a movement from under his pillow, but he was too scared to look away from the door as he hears again, just outside the frame, the wail of, "Where's my golden arm?" It felt like hellfire on his back as he felt the hot metal of the hand on his back, seemingly crawling on its own as he watches the doorknob turn. The maid found his body that morning, face frozen in horror and hair a bright white, hands still clutching the sheets around his body. But the strangest thing was that his dead wife's golden arm was on his chest, hand wrapped tightly around his throat. I've been telling this one since I was little. I love it. I hope you enjoy. It's not super scary, but it's nice and spooky, so hopefully you'll still like it. I work in the Nevada desert. A little facility out in the middle of nowhere. To get home it's about an hour drive of pretty much nothing. One day driving home, my car ran out of gas. I've always wondered if this dreaded day would come and here we are. I had no choice but to start walking. I always drove past this little roadside motel, so I guess I don't have much of a choice. I walked a couple miles until I got to it. I asked the front desk if they had any gas I could use. They said yes, but it would cost me. It was way too expensive. I didn't even have enough on me, so I had no choice but to clean dishes and do other odd jobs around the place for the rest of the night. By the end I had made enough money, but I was completely beat. No way I could drive after that. I asked if I could at least use a room for the night. Not wanting to cause an accident, the owner said yes. Thank God. Although what he said after surprised me to say the least. We have 2 rooms available. One's haunted, and there's another next to it. I laughed it off, figuring it was just him messing with me after the long day, friendly jokes. Just to be safe I chose the room next to it. When I got in there, what a dump. Just a shitty table with a shitty bed and a shitty broken fridge. I sat down on the bed, exhausted. I looked up to see there was a hole in the wall, about the size of a coin. Wow. How classy. Out of curiosity I looked through the hole with one eye. I saw the room next to mine. At the table, a young woman was seated brushing her long brown hair. She was beautiful, from the back at least. I didn't want to be a creep, so I just went to bed. A couple hours later I woke up with an uncomfortable feeling. Just in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. I sat up and saw the hole in the wall was now glowing. I kneeled back down to it and peered through. All I could see was red. Bright, glowing red. I figured the woman had just placed something, I don't know, an electronic in front of the hole. I went back to bed, unable to shake the feeling. The next morning when I woke up, I headed straight to the front desk to get all paid so I could get the hell out. As I got the gas I decided to ask the owner. Hey, that woman in the room next to mine. Is she alright? I was getting kind of a bad feeling. The owner laughed at me. Oh, so you saw her. She's the haunted room's resident. I laughed it off again, trying to continue to joke around with sarcasm. Well, she's awfully pretty for a ghost. The owner handed me the gas tank. Then you haven't seen her from the front. Her eyes are glowing red. So I'm an avid storyteller and I know how to scare people, at least the ones I'm around, so I made this up to tell my cousins when I was younger. The story begins not long ago. In fact, not far from here either. It's a small land of mystery, fairies, goblins, giants, werewolves, and the most deadly creature of all. The lamphine. Pause for effect now. The lamphine is a tall creature. Hair as yellow as the sun and arms as dark as the cloudy night sky. It only comes out every great once in a while. In fact, it only comes out once every 42 full moons. Let confusion settle. Oh, I do believe tonight is that full moon. Maybe, maybe not. I can't remember. But that's not the story here. It began on a night like this. A bunch of children were up past their bedtime telling scary stories. The oldest, let's call him Jack, had just finished telling his Hookman story when giggling was heard behind him. The girls all shrieked and the boys jumped. Jack turned around, assuming it was one of the adults messing with them. Come out, he said. His voice was slightly quivering. Now this was a bad thing because the lamphine loves fear. It brings it the greatest of pleasures. Cracking of twigs could be heard as a loud breathing came into their existence. Jack became terrified and slowly backed away, falling over his log. More high-pitched giggles. All the children at this point were crying and screaming for their parents. Jack turned to run to the others, being several feet from them, when his leg was grabbed. He screamed as he was dragged back into the dark woods. They could hear him screaming in agony until a loud crunching noise stopped the screams. More giggling. The air got colder as something was thrown out of the woods. Jack's head rolled to a stop in front of them. Screams filled the woods until each and every once of their voices were silenced by a snapping and giggling. The lamphine only left behind the fear-stricken heads of the children, and their bodies were never found. At this point I would throw my voice and make giggling noises sound like they were coming from the woods. If you can't throw your voice, have someone else giggle in a really high-pitched voice and snap some twigs. So a story I always tell around a campfire that I think is quite spooky is the legend of El Silbón, The Whistling Ghost, it's a Venezuelan folktale, but I have a tradition of telling it. Anyway, the legend goes that on cold dark nights in remote places, especially in South America, a whistle can be heard coming down the road. At first it will seem loud, like it's right next to you, but as time passes it begins to fade and get more and more quiet until it's almost gone. The trick is El Silban's whistle gets louder, he's further away, and when he's right next to you the whistle is very faint and sounds like it's far away. Once El Silban is at your doorstep, he will sit down and begin to count the skulls of his victims, and you have to listen to him count every single skull, or one of your family members will die soon after and become one of his skulls. El Silban is said to dress like a farmer with a large straw hat, torn clothes, ghostly aura and a pale dead face. It's not that scary, but it's interesting. We have old one here in SA. A farmer, while on his way home, is caught in a terrible thunderstorm with his horse. Completely lost, he realizes he will either freeze to death or get struck by lightning if he doesn't find a place to stay. Through the storm, he comes across a small homestead, the yellow candlelight visible through the sheets of rain. Lighting flashes brightly, thunder barely a breath later, and he leads his terrified horse to the small house. Tying the petrified animal to the fence, he knocks on the door and an old lady opens it with a smile. She ushers him in and he finds her husband smoking a pipe. He is seated at the kitchen table, and the wife quickly boils the kettle and gives him a bowl of hot soup and a cup of coffee. The farmer tells the old couple his story, and they are happy to serve as his sanctuary against the storm. Outside the lightning flashes again, followed with a bout of thunder, and the old man smiles when jumps, offering him a bit of tobacco for his pipe to calm his nerves. The farmer accepts gratefully. The next bolt slams close, ripping through the ground, almost deafening him completely. He jumps up with a cry, startled out of his wits, only to find himself standing in the dark and cold. Soaked wet by the rain, with no sign of the couple, broken stones littered around him, and his horse tied to a tree branch. Without thinking, he jumps on his spooked horse and gallops as fast as he can away from the place. He would reach a town sometime during the night. At a tavern, after sharing his story, the folks tell him of the small cottage nearby which had been struck by lightning a long time ago, and of the couple that was killed in the fire. It's pretty simple and I will not drag it out. So here it goes. One day my neighbor walked over into my backyard while I was in my garden. He looked disheveled and was wearing pajamas. When I stood up I noticed his eyes were sunken in and it looked as if he lost a lot of weight. I tried to crack a joke about how this would be a great day to go down to the beach if it were not for the weather being so cold. But the joke fell flat. A week later I bumped into his wife at the post office. She was in line in front of me mailing about a dozen packages. I asked if her husband was feeling better because he looked a bit under the weather last week when he was in my backyard. She tells me I must have been mistaken. He passed away over a month ago from cancer. The packages she was mailing were his action figure toy collection she sold online. I was speechless. Was I crazy? Maybe I did misjudge the weekend I thought I saw him. Then I really thought hard. I did not remember him saying anything to me. I did remember telling him the joke and it falling flat. I assumed I wasn't funny and that's why he didn't laugh. Or maybe he couldn't because it may have been just his spirit. When I returned home from the post office I immediately start telling my wife about our neighbor. Before I could get out he had passed away from cancer. She says, "Oh yeah, I saw you guys talking last weekend." And then I tell her about seeing his wife at the post office and being told about his passing. So we go to our security camera and play back the video from the week before. It's clear in the video that I do stand up, it's obvious I'm acknowledging the presence of someone and have a brief conversation. And then I go back to tending to my garden. But on the video the entire time I was the only person in my backyard. Why I'm no longer a park ranger. When I was a park ranger, I usually worked the day shift, but there had lately been a lot of night shift guys quitting. It was obviously inevitable that I would be asked to do night shift. I arrived at the watchtower at 5 p.m. The watchtower was next to one of those large ponds/small lakes. I climbed up the stairs to the top and entered the tower room. There was one clear glass wall and 3 wooden opaque walls. Inside was a bed with a nightstand next to it on the right. There was also a kitchenette with 2 sets of cabinets on the left-hand side. Next to the glass wall on the far side of the room was a radio communication station. On the nightstand was a flashlight. Inside the nightstand were a pair of binoculars and a long-range walkie-talkie. Inside the small cabinets was food. I couldn't open the big cabinets for some reason. There was most likely stuff in there that were above my pay grade. Around the watchtower room was a walkway. Anyways, I went to the communication station and radioed my partner Donnie, who was at the main ranger station. I said, "Well Donnie, it looks like it's just us tonight." He didn't reply though, so I assumed he was in the bathroom. So I took the binoculars and walkie-talkie and stepped onto the walkway. I scanned the far ridge, the roads, and the forest below. I was looking for illegal campsites, troublemakers, and other riffraff. As I passed my binoculars across the far ridge, I saw what looked like a snowman. I had a double take and thought, a snowman? In the middle of July? I looked again and saw that it wasn't a snowman but a kid wearing a ghost costume. Just staring at the watchtower. The costume was a sheet pulled over with 2 eye holes cut out, like the ghost costumes in Charlie Brown. So I radioed Donnie again and asked, "Hey Donnie, are you there?" Donnie responded, "Yeah, I just made it out." I got a chuckle out of that. Donnie was always good for a laugh. I then said, "Yeah. Say, can you check out the ridge? I saw a kid up there wearing a ghost costume. You know, a sheet with eye holes cut out." "You mean like from Charlie Brown Halloween?" he asked. "Yes." Donnie then left the ranger station and headed for the ridge. About 40 minutes later, the sun had set and it was a bit dark. I scanned the ridge again, but the kid in the ghost costume was gone. So I radioed Donnie again, "Are you there?" Donnie responded, "I'm almost at the ridge." "What's up?" I said, "You might want to search the surrounding area, the kid has moved." "Sure thing." About 10 minutes later, I saw Donnie's flashlight shining on the ridge in the distance. I looked in my binoculars and saw Donnie shining the light around and Donnie shrugging. He then radioed me and said, "I don't see anyone H." Donnie's flashlight then went out and there was just static on the radio. I spoke into the radio, "Donnie? Donnie? Donnie? Are you there? What happened?" Just then I heard a loud shriek coming from the base of the tower. I shined my flashlight down and saw, right between the tower and the pond, a pale, blue woman with empty eye sockets staring at me. All of her limbs looked broken and bent in the wrong way. Just then she started sprinting up the stairs towards the top where I was. I had never seen anyone move that fast. She was running faster than Olympic runners. I freaked out, ran inside, grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, locked the door, and hid next to it. There was no way she could run up those steps that fast, even if her limbs weren't broken. Then I heard the sound of one of the big cabinets opening. My blood ran cold. I slowly looked over at the cabinets to see one of the big ones wide open with the ghost from the ridge looking right at me. I froze in fear. That is until I heard it giggling. I recognized that giggle. I pulled off the sheet and saw it was one of Donnie's kids. He pulled out a walkie-talkie and said, "Hey Dad, we got him." I heard Donnie's voice come over the radio, "Ha ha ha, good job." I grabbed that walkie-talkie and said, "Ha ha, very funny you jerk." Donnie replied, "Yeah, listening to you scream like a girl was the best bit." I responded, "Yeah, screw you too, Donnie. By the way, that wasn't me who screamed, that was that zombie chick at the stairs." "Who is that, your wife?" Donnie hesitated in responding and just stuttered out, "Am I wife? Do ghosts look like zombies from that distance? You said it yourself, it looked like a Charlie Brown ghost." I then said, "Not the ghosts. There was a woman at the bottom of the tower. She shrieked and ran up the stairs faster than an Olympic runner." Donnie then said, "Ooh yeah. I didn't put a woman on the stairs." Needless to say, I put in my resignation when my shift was over. 100 years ago, out in the waters around Spivey Point, a small clipper ship drew toward land. Suddenly, out of the night, the fog rolled in. For a moment, they could see nothing, not a foot in front of them. Then, they saw a light. By God, it was a fire burning on the shore, strong enough to penetrate the swirling mist. They steered a course toward the light. But it was a campfire, like this one. The ship crashed against the rocks, the hull sheared in two, masts snapped like a twig. The wreckage sank, with all the men aboard. At the bottom of the sea, lay the Elizabeth Dane, with her crew, their lungs filled with salt water, their eyes open, staring to the darkness. And above, as suddenly as it come, the fog lifted, receded back across the ocean and never came again. But it is told by the fishermen, and their fathers and grandfathers, that when the fog returns to Antonio Bay, the men at the bottom of the sea, out in the water by Spivey Point, will rise up and search for the campfire that led them to their dark, icy death. When I was a kid, my mom told the scariest stories. We would beg her to tell one and always regret it after. This one really stuck with me. I don't know why. It's not a campfire story, but close enough. She had taken me, my siblings, and two of my friends to a nearby mountain, and we had spent the whole day hiking around. When we got back to the minivan, we discovered the side door had been left open. We all laughed, didn't think much of it, and piled in. The sun was setting and my friends were begging to hear one of my mom's famous scary stories, but I was begging them not to. Eventually she relented and started telling this tale. It started by describing the very day we just had, climbing around on the mountain rocks, having a good time. But unbeknownst to us, something was crawling down the mountain toward the parking lot. She described this creature in great detail. It was human, but missing its eyes, so it had to sniff around at the leaves to search for prey. It only had arms which it used to lope and drag its heavy torso across the ground, sniffing as it went. Eventually its nose proved true and it sniffed out our car, finding the open door and pulling itself in. It dragged its body underneath the back seats where we were sitting now. At this point it was dark, and we were getting tired. My mother knew this and warned us not to fall asleep because, in the story, the creature waited, hiding under the seats, watching our legs dancing in front of it. It waited until we began drifting off, then opened his mouth, revealing long sharp teeth, and bit into one of our legs. The girl it bit became petrified, sitting in the seat like a frozen zombie. It went through us one by one, while the mom in the story continued driving, assuming everyone in the back has fallen asleep. At this point, IRL, we had all pulled up, legs up, and were clutching our knees to our chest and sweating with panic. Eventually, in the story, the mom gets to my friend's house to drop them off. She calls out to them, and is surprised when no one answers back. Still, she assumes the kids are all sleeping. So she climbs out and opens the back door and is alarmed to find the children sitting in the back, eyes wide open, faces pale and already rotting. She tries to run and call for help, but before she can go anywhere, the thing gets her too. We were so freaking terrified, we went home the entire way curled up like that, and my legs ached so much. When we did get to my friend's house, my mom had to open the door for them so they could literally leap out of the car without once touching the floor of the inside of the car. My friends never asked her for another story after that. I was lost in the woods as night was falling. I'd been walking all day and was desperate to find somewhere to shelter. In the darkness I came across a lonely cabin, and without even thinking I knocked on the door. When there was no answer, I decided to try the handle. The door was unlocked. I got in and threw myself on the single bed in the middle of the room. I felt bad about breaking in, but I was exhausted and fell asleep almost instantly. In the middle of the night, I woke up. But something kept me from going back to sleep. I hadn't noticed before, but on the wooden walls hung the most sinister paintings I'd ever seen. They were portraits. Horrible portraits of faces twisted in rage and fear, as if all the ugliness in the world was glaring down at me. Lying there in the dark, I shivered and somehow knew that the faces in the paintings were looking at me as an intruder. And how they hated me for it. Eventually my tiredness must have overcome my fear and I drifted off into the darkness of a dreamless sleep. That morning when I woke up, with the call of the forest birds flitting through the air, I opened my eyes, but I almost wished I hadn't. Because when I looked around the sagging walls, I realized that those things I'd seen the night before weren't paintings at all. They were windows. Radio silence. 36,400,000. That is the expected number of intelligent civilizations in our galaxy, according to Drake's famous equation. For the last 78 years, we had been broadcasting everything about us, our radio, our television, our history, our greatest discoveries, to the rest of the galaxy. We had been shouting our existence at the top of our lungs to the rest of the universe, wondering if we were alone. 36 million civilizations, yet in almost a century of listening, we hadn't heard a thing. We were alone. That was, until about 5 minutes ago. The transmission came on every transcendental multiple of hydrogen's frequency that we're listening to. Transcendental harmonics, things like hydrogen's frequency times pi, don't appear in nature, so I knew it had to be artificial. The signal pulsed on and off very quickly with incredibly uniform amplitudes. My initial reaction was that this was some sort of binary transmission. I measured 1,679 pulses in the 1 minute that the transmission was active. After that, the silence resumed. The numbers didn't make any sense at first. They just seemed to be a random jumble of noise. But the pulses were so perfectly uniform, and on a frequency that was always so silent, they had to come from an artificial source. I looked over the transmission again, and my heart skipped a beat. 1,679, that was the exact length of the Arecibo message sent out 40 years ago. I excitedly started arranging the bits in the original 73 by 23 rectangle. I didn't get more than halfway through before my hopes were confirmed. This was the exact same message. The numbers in binary, from 1 to 10. The atomic numbers of the elements that make up life. The formulas for our DNA nucleotides. Someone had been listening to us, and wanted us to know they were there. Then it came to me, this original message was transmitted only 40 years ago. This means that life must be at most 20 light years away. A civilization within talking distance? This would revolutionize every field I have ever worked in: astrophysics, astrobiology, astro. The signal is beeping again. This time, it is slow. Deliberate, even. It lasts just under 5 minutes, with a new bit coming in once per second. Though the computers are of course recording it, I start writing them down. 0. 1. 0. 1. 0. 1. 0. 0. I knew immediately this wasn't the same message as before. My mind races through the possibilities of what this could be. The transmission ends, having transmitted 248 bits. Surely this is too small for a meaningful message. What great message to another civilization can you possibly send with only 248 bits of information? On a computer, the only files that small would be limited to text. Was it possible? Were they really sending a message to us in our own language? Come to think of it, it's not that out of the question. We had been transmitting pretty much every language on Earth for the last 70 years. I begin to decipher with the first encoding scheme I could think of: ASCII. 0. 1. 0. 1. 0. 1. 0. 0. That's B. 0. 1. 1 0. 0. 1. 0. 1. E. As I finish piecing together the message, my stomach sinks like an anchor. The words before me answer everything. Be quiet or they will hear you. Not my story, but my cousin's. He swears it's true and I'm inclined to believe him. To preface, we live in the southern US, and when he was a kid there would be lots of Hispanic families who came through our small town as migrant workers. They would stay a while, taking up residence in whatever housing was available, often small empty rural houses outside of town. Then when the work dried up due to harvest season ending or the occasional immigration bust, they'd pull out of town at a moment's notice. These houses that they'd lived in would become abandoned overnight for a few months until another family took up residence there, so forth and so on. So around Christmas time in the late 80s/early 90s, my cousin and his friends are all having a sleepover at a friend's house, during one of our rare snowstorms. This particular friend's dad was ex-military and had a pretty cool collection of surplus gear, namely, a pair of night vision goggles. My cousin and his friends were looking through these goggles at the snowfall. They said it looked incredible through the goggles, when they noticed something strange. A nearby house which they knew to be recently abandoned, due to the family pulling their son, a classmate of my cousin, out of school and moving away, had a single light on in the attic. So as a group of teenagers tend to do, they decided to investigate. They put on all their warm clothes, and walked over to the house. When they arrived, sure enough there was light in the attic, seemingly candlelight. They were all too spooked to actually enter while someone was clearly there, and resolved to return and check it out in the daylight. The next morning they all trekked back over to the house and, not seeing any more light from the attic, made their way inside. As they expected, the house was completely cleared out. Now this is probably hyperbole, or a teenager's overactive imagination, but my cousin swears that when they pulled open the trapdoor to the attic, a cold wind rushed past them. As they climbed into the attic they noticed it was just as barren as the rest of the house, save one central feature. There, in the middle of the attic was a bloody sacrificed lamb, nailed to a crucifix. My cousin says he thinks maybe it had something to do with a weird sect of Catholicism or something, but that the scariest part to him is that they almost went into the house during whatever this ritual was. My dad used to tell this one. He said he read it in a book when he was a teenager. There was once a pastor and his wife who came from the city to an old parish in a rural area. The people of the church had driven every single pastor out of the church since its founding. No one was good enough for them, and some people said they would have found fault with the angels. The pastor and his wife didn't stand a chance. They were both heavily criticized by the members. The pastor preached the Bible too much, he preached it too little, his wife dressed up too much, his wife underdressed, the pastor was greedy and wanted all their money, the wife, Alice, was a snob, and worst of all they were from the city. They refused to pay them enough to move away and the couple were, unfortunately, trapped there. The criticism continued and increased and became extremely malicious, until tragically Alice could take it no longer and killed herself. The very next Sunday night after the funeral they had a business meeting. The church elders cruelly belittled the pastor for his many faults, and some even implied he was the reason his wife had died. At this final cruel criticism, there was a horrible scream, and down from the belfry came Alice shrieking accusations at the elders. She was dressed in her funeral clothes, with her hair loose, and her eyes wild and full of hatred. They all fled. The next Sunday morning, Alice again came shrieking down. Every time the church tried to meet, there would be Alice, and they were finally forced to abandon the building after a failed exorcism. To this day the church remains empty, and anyone that tries to buy or meet in it, is driven off by the vengeful ghost of Alice. If you ever find yourself camping around the San Gabriel Mountains, you can tell this one. Years before written history, Native Americans that lived in the area told stories of the people that lived in the mountains. Men that came at dusk. I haven't heard their oral histories, and many of these things are kept hidden and secret from those that aren't members of the tribe, and even then rarely spoken of. I can tell you of the accounts I've read and of what I experienced in those hills about 6 years ago. 6 years ago around February, I had just been released from Marine Corps boot camp and was spending a week with my family before heading back to Marine Combat School. Anyway, I got into a spat with my sister when I got back. She and her boyfriend had been smoking pot near my military stuff, and I couldn't have it smelling like weed. They got defensive and it ended up with me out on my ass for the day. So I take a trip to the hills. Figured I can at least keep myself in shape. I get to the entrance of one of my favorite trails a little after noon. A place called Hermit Falls. An easy hike that ends with a place you can cliff jump off of into a couple of craters filled with water. The hike was nothing special. Neither was the time I spent sunning and jumping into the water. There's always someone there since it's pretty popular, so I spent most of my time bullshitting with locals and talking about how badass boot camp was like the brainwashed boot I was. At some point I decided I'd close my eyes and rest a bit, and that was my mistake. When I woke up, the sun had already gone behind the valley the craters made, and it cast the falls in a premature night. I immediately was wide awake thinking how screwed I was. I grabbed my bag, I had been using it as pillow. Threw on a shirt, pulled on my boots and started back up the trail. I patted myself down as I was walking down, making sure I hadn't left anything, and looked back to give the ground a quick search when my throat caught. I'd gotten up high enough that the red of the sun over the valley was just visible. Standing in a semicircle around the falls were 5 motionless men, completely shadowed by the red light behind them. Then I heard a shuffle of bushes behind me and flipped around thinking I was going to be attacked. Instead, on the other side of the river that led into the falls, was another man, still shrouded by shadow but more detailed. I could see a hat long brimmed, and he carried a walking stick in one hand. He extended a hand and beckoned. Before turning and disappear without noise into the brush. Momentarily stunned, I looked back to where the other 5 had been, but the sunlight had faded completely, and even if they'd still been there I wouldn't have been able to make them out. Then, like a pop, the sound of crickets and frogs came out of nowhere. Like they'd always been there, but the noise had been suppressed. I ran back to my car, went home, and didn't talk about it until a few years after that, when a buddy of mine mentioned the shadow people. I told him and we looked into it together. Found articles and articles on them. They show up all over the country. But the one with the walking stick, has been sighted multiple times in the mountains in California. There's a lot of lore around him, and most of it is Native American, though I can't remember the tribe or tribes. If you take the time to look into it, you'll see what I mean. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened had I followed him. Most of the time I try not to think about it. Me and my wife have a knack for going off the beaten path when we travel. One night while on our way to see family in New England, we find a cute town not too far from the highway to rest for the night. Of course, we choose the local inn rather than a hotel chain. As we step into the inn, I see some flyers for local trails and points of interest. I also see a flyer titled "Come Visit the Haunted Hill Farm Inn," which was the inn we were staying in. I jokingly asked reception about the haunting. She claimed the haunted room was room 103, but that they didn't rent out that room anymore. Too many complaints, nightmares, early checkouts, and even some physical injury that caused some legal concern for the establishment. I assume it's all to draw business. We grab our room's old-style skeleton key and head down the hallway to our room. My wife points out along the way, "Look honey, it's room 103. Of course we can't get in or anything, but I decided to look through the keyhole and found red. Nothing but the color red. Not necessarily a crimson red, a little darker than that. I stood up, shrugged, and off we went on to our room. Slept well, and checked out the next morning. While we were checking out, I asked, "So what's supposed to be in room 103? Some kind of ghost?" The receptionist replied, "The ghost of a young woman haunts that room. The story is that when she reveals herself, she floats, wears a colonial-style nightgown, has straight black hair, and deep red eyes." I don't really have a story you would tell, but I do have a story from a time I was around a campfire. It was New Year's Eve 2015 and we were camping out in the desert in Southern California. It was a camping spot on BLM land, kinda in the middle of nowhere. Right before we started a campfire for the night, we all dropped a bunch of acid. The night was absolutely amazing. The stars out there are so incredible. It seems like you can see the entire universe. We saw multiple shooting stars and satellites passing overhead. We were all pretty deep in the hippie game, playing with fire, giving light shoes and massages. All around it was a really amazing night. As the ball dropped, we all took some and got settled into another nice come up. At around 1:30 a.m. we noticed headlights coming from the desert. The only road that I knew of in that area was in the opposite direction, and I've been camping at this exact spot since I was 16, and had never seen anyone. As the vehicle got closer, we realized it was an older pickup truck, but had giant floodlights all around it, so it looked incredibly intimidating. It pulled about 50 yards away from us, facing us, so our entire campsite was fairly lit up. I just remember everyone kinda being deer in the headlights as I slowly went to grab the axe that was next to my camping chair. After what seemed like forever, the truck turned off its lights and engine, and we couldn't hear or see anything coming from that direction. At that point we were all fairly certain we were about to be murdered. 2 guys and 4 girls to whoever they had in the truck. All we had was an axe, a knife and some longer, thicker firewood. We armed ourselves with what we had and just kinda waited to see or hear something. After about 30 minutes nothing happened, and after an hour we had all completely forgot that the truck was even there. The drugs brought us back to a chill night. Not soon after that they made their first move and we were unprepared. All of a sudden out of the darkness we hear a loud pop. We panic for a moment and then we see it. A bright flash in the sky. A fucking firework. They light off a few more over the course of the hour and then drive off around 3 a.m. To this day it was still the scariest and strangest thing I've encountered while camping or in the wilderness. When my uncle attended university in the early 80s, he was among a group of fraternity brothers responsible for recruiting freshmen, who went through a particular kind of hazing, involving a supposed haunted house a few miles from campus. An old 3-story Victorian-style mansion left abandoned and withering away to the elements after, rumor has it, the father of the family that resided within had one day gone mad and murdered his wife and 3 children with a hatchet and then hung himself from the 2nd-story stairwell. The hazing involved sending 3 freshman potential fraternity recruits to said house, at 3 a.m., 2 equipped with a unique item relating to the murders and all 3 with a candle and a match. The freshmen would be sent one at a time to the house, observed from afar bt the frat boys. They were instructed to enter the house, light their candle, and ascend each floor until they got to the attic. They were told to stop at each main picture window of each floor and let their candle show in the window, to prove they were actually there and completing the challenge. My uncle was a senior member of the fraternity, and he ended up having a worse outcome than anyone else involved. So the night comes, the fated night that changed multiple people's lives irreversibly, forever. My uncle, 4 of his frat brothers and 3 freshman potential frat brothers arrive at a small bridge on the outskirts of the house around 2:30 a.m. The night is cold and still, clouds ride across an almost full moon, illuminating the old house and casting eerie shadows. The 3 freshmen are given separate items alongside their candles and matches. The first gets a hatchet, representing the murder weapon. The second is given a rope, representing the suicide method. The third is given a second match, because he's told it's almost certain his candle will not burn true after the first 2 ascend the stairs and disturb the spirits. So my uncle, the frat brothers, and the other 2 freshmen watch as the first recruit approaches the old house with a hatchet, a candle, and a match in hand. Nervously, he enters, and in the dark night the rest can plainly see the match strike, light, and ignite the candle. This house had many large picture windows, and the whole group watches as a glow illuminates the first floor windows, passing one by one, until the stairs, when it begins to rise, 1st floor, 2nd floor, and then the candle goes out. They spectate for a minute, most likely a draft, or moving too fast from panic. So they send the 2nd freshman recruit, equipped with a rope, candle and match. And eerily enough, the same events unfold. 1st floor, 2nd floor, and the candle goes out. The 3rd and last recruit is obviously shaken, but the frat brothers try to rationalize the situation by explaining that the other 2 recruits are probably just messing with them. Holed up in the 2nd floor, laughing in the dark and sipping on a hip flask. My uncle says he didn't believe this, but he just laughed and agreed to ease the tension. So they send the 3rd freshman to investigate, give his buddies a kick in the ass and remind them that they can't join the frat unless they make it to the attic and prove it with the candle glowing in the window. With nothing but a candle and 2 matches, the 3rd visibly trembling freshman approaches the house, gives an apprehensive look back to the group, then enters. Again, it happens, the same thing, 1st floor, 2nd floor, and the candle goes out. It doesn't relight, despite the 2nd match. My uncle and his buddies are perplexed. Do these guys just not want to join the frat? Are they just screwing with them to be cocky or prove something? It's got to be freezing, dark and miserable in that old house. What do they have to gain? So they wait. And wait. And wait. 2 hours have passed, the beer has all been drunk and my uncle and his frat buddies are just annoyed at this point. So they say, leave them, let the freshmen enjoy their little prank and sit in the cold and dark, not going to give them the satisfaction. So they go back to the dorm and sleep it off, eager to see the freshman recruits the next day and inform them that they failed the test and hope it was worth it. But the freshmen never show up. In fact, they still haven't showed up the next day either. Nervous, my uncle and his buddies decide to investigate the old house before getting police involved and potentially a massive scandal. Well, what they found, my uncle never forgot or forgave himself. At the top of the second floor stairway, they found the first freshman, face down in a pool of blood with a hatchet buried in his head. Hanging by the rope he brought was the second freshman, dangling from the second floor railing. Panicked and horrified, they call the police. The third freshman was never found, but there were footprints in the dust leading up the stairs, and out an open window. The police never found him, and he is believed to the top suspect. Why would he kill his friends? No known motive, but he's the only suspect and is still missing to this day. After an extensive investigation, no charges are filed on the frat or my uncle due to lack of evidence. My uncle's fraternity completely disbanded after the incident. Hazing gone wrong ends in 2 grisly deaths, the papers said, big mess swept under the rug. But then the incidents started happening. Now here's the even more peculiar part of the whole mess. Each year, almost on the dot, the night of the deaths of those 2 freshmen, my uncle's frat brothers started dropping like flies, one at a time. Grief-stricken, suicide, alcoholism, tragic accident. Each was explained away and forgotten, only my uncle seemed to draw the connection and it haunted him for the rest of his life. Until he was the last one left. 12 years later, he found himself the last of his fraternity to be alive, and the anniversary was approaching. Terrified, he panicked, sold all his worldly possessions and decided to live the vagrant rail-riding hobo lifestyle. Who knows why? We certainly don't. All we know is how he was found, 2 days after the anniversary. He was found at a railway station by a worker unloading boxcars. He was found alone, dead and cold, a horrible shocked look frozen on his face. Beside him was a candle and 2 burnt-out matches, and scratched into the door of the boxcar.